Hey, virtual students, we're going to talk about the Federal Reserve today and what they are able to do to affect those interest rates we talked about in the previous part. These are what your notes look like. Once we get down to the end, you're going to fill out these charts. You'll see what they look like as we go. But let's get started. So, first of all, just a quick little reminder on what are some factors that are determined on how much money you are allowed to borrow. Okay, hopefully you're putting something in there about how much your money you make. Do you have other loans out? Um, those are really the big ones. The rest of the economy, maybe you have to have a job and things like that. So that kind of goes with how much money you make. But really, that's what it eventually boils down to. How reliable are you to pay back money? Throw in the interest rate, okay? And again, that's going to be determined. That's going to help determine how much you can borrow. Higher interest rate means you borrow less. Lower interest rate means you're able to borrow more. So this Federal Reserve System, they are relatively, I don't want to call them new, but they weren't around for the entirety of the United States history. They started actually in 1913, they started trying to regulate the banking system. And we had some situations with banks that people would take their savings accounts out like at the last minute and people not paying loans. It was kind of a mess. So the United States government decided they were going to monitor it a little bit closer. They came up with this Federal Reserve System. Sometimes it's referred to as the Fed. Now, the structure you want to understand is that these people in the Federal Reserve that make these decisions do not get elected. Okay, they are appointed by the president and approved by Congress, and they actually serve 14-year terms. So it's a new guy every 2 years. They kind of walk it through, and they make the decisions eventually on what's going to happen. The current chairperson's name is Jerome Powell. He could be on TV here and there. But again, he's kind of the leader, I guess. He's not like a boss or anything. He's just kind of the chairperson. He's the one that talks the most. But again, they are appointed by the president, approved by Congress. Okay. They've got some other people that work for them. It's not necessarily super important to know these guys, but just like any other organization, they've got some people that are advisors and make suggestions and things like that. And then this Federal Reserve Bank, they monitor these smaller banks, and we'll talk about how they do that and what happens if banks break rules. Okay. The big thing is one way it's referred to of what the Federal Reserve does is that they regulate the money supply. And that basically means the way they do that is the supply of money is determined by how much money people save. And eventually the Federal Reserve is going to allow banks to loan out a certain percentage of that. We'll talk about that further as we continue to go. All right. There are some, again, sometimes people think the Federal Reserve has a little bit too much power, and especially since they're not really necessarily, they weren't have been around for the entirety of the United States, that they shouldn't necessarily be around. But there's going to be criticisms about everything. Okay. Quick review of words: loose money supply, tight money supply, expansionary for loose, contractionary for tight. Just a couple different things that different words that they use to talk about the same thing. All right. So the idea of the Federal Reserve is they implement what is referred to as fractional reserve banking. Okay. So what that means is that banks are only allowed to loan out a fraction of people's savings. Okay. Now, the first thing they can do is change that percentage. All right. So as you're on your chart, okay, we've got to keep in mind, all right, and let's understand here. Let's go back here so you can listen for a second, okay? You've got to understand that banks make money by loaning out money that you save, all right? If they just hold your money in a safe, that money does nothing. And in fact, if there's inflation, that money actually loses value. So a bank has to loan that money out to be able to make money. Now, currently, banks can loan out. Let's say a bank has $1 million in it. Okay. Now, if we set this reserve requirement at 10%, okay, so that's a reserve requirement. that bank can loan out 900,000. Okay, if we set the reserve requirement at 20%, that means the bank can loan out 800,000. Okay, and if we set the reserve, say, at 5%, that means the bank can loan out 950,000. Okay, now you don't need to necessarily be able to figure out those percentages. Okay, but understand that the bank has to loan that money to earn an income for the bank revenue. Now, I like to try to compare it to, like, if I'm a grocery store and I'm trying to sell bananas, right? And we're talking about setting interest rates, okay? Which the price of bananas, here's the risky thing about selling bananas. If you set the price of bananas too high, right? No one buys them. Well, what happens after a very short period of time? They're going to go bad, right? So I've got to lower my price right now. Same thing with banks. If I can't sell my money, okay, I've got to lower my interest rate or I'm going to make no money at all, right? I'm going to lose my revenue. And so I'm going to fluctuate my interest rates based on the idea that I have to get this money out of here. Okay, like I said, kind of comparing it with bananas a little bit. Not perfect analogy, but understand that I've got to sell this stuff, okay, or it loses complete value. Okay, expand things. We're going to lower the percentage. I'm going to get more bananas. Right now, I got to sell more of them. I've got to lower the price. Less bananas, less money. I'm going to raise the interest. I'm going to raise the reserve requirement, and I'm going to obviously have to raise my price so everybody can get the stuff that they need, okay, or want, and I can increase my revenue with less product. All right, the next thing we can do, all right, and here's the tricky part. You've got to understand that a bank can never loan out more than this reserve requirement, this fraction, right? They've got to keep a fraction. So in this case, at 10%, they've always got to have $100,000 in their safe, $50,000 in 5%, $200,000 in the 20%. They've got to have that in there no matter what. If they go below it, okay, if they screw things up and go below it, they've got to borrow money from another bank or each other. Okay. Now, this discount rate is simply another way of saying interest rate. Okay. And this interest rate is what banks have to pay each other if they have to borrow money from each other. So to increase the money supply, we're going to lower this penalty. Okay, I'm going to make it super cheap for banks to borrow from each other. I'm going to lower this penalty. All right. If I'm going to try to slow things down, I'm going to raise this penalty. Okay, kind of think about if you've ever gotten a speeding ticket before, right? And you go, you might go like 3 or 4 miles an hour over the speed limit, right? And that's based on the penalty that you have for getting a speeding ticket, right? 150 bucks, 180 bucks, whatever it is, right? Well, think about how much you'd go over the speed limit if the penalty was $500 or $1,000, right? Think about how much you'd go over the speed limit if it was only $20, right? And so this is that penalty. They're trying to, find that, how close do I get to that reserve requirement? If I lower the penalty, banks are going to get super close. If the penalty is expensive, I'm not going to get very close to it because that's going to cost me money in paying interest to other banks. All right. Now, the last thing that the Federal Reserve can do are conduct open market operations. Okay. And these are a little bit tricky to understand. All right. So I'm going to try to draw this out here. Okay. Give me a quick second and talk about what happens. Go ahead and take a second here and write these things in there. All right. Pause if you need to. So I've got three entities at play here. So I've got banks. Okay, so I've got my bank, I've got a saver, as in a person, and I've got my government over here. Okay, that sells government bonds. Okay, and this is the Federal Reserve. Okay, so maybe I'll put the Fed over here. Okay, so just abbreviate it. Okay, so here's the deal. All right, let's say I've got my interest rates. All righty, Let's just say I set my interest rates at 5%. Okay. Now, let's say that the economy is moving along, all right, and my saver here has some money in his pockets, all right, and the government says, now that saver is going to put some of that money into the bank, right? So it's set this interest rate at 5% in this particular case. All right. So let's say the federal government says we want to slow it down. We want contraction. Okay? We want to slow things down. Contractionary policy. Slow. Okay. All right. So they're going to sell bonds. Okay, go back to my previous slide here. Sell means smaller. I'm explaining this bottom one first. All right, now this saver here, he's got his money in a safe. He doesn't necessarily need to spend it, but he says, okay, they're going to sell bonds. And so the saver, all right, is going to say, you know what? I can make more money by buying this bond, okay, from the government. The bond is going to be sold to this saver here. Okay, well, what does that saver do with his money? He's going to take his money out and he's going to go put it over here in the Federal Reserve. So now the bank doesn't have any money in it. So what do they got to do with their interest rates? They don't have as many bananas to sell. They have to raise their interest rates to say 6%. Okay, so the government sells those bonds, right? The saver takes his money out. The bank has less money to hold on to, less money to loan. They've got to raise interest rates. Okay, let's kind of flip it. All right, so now we're going to say that, again, we're going to kind of start it over here. The government has the money. They're holding on to it at the Federal Reserve. No one can get it. The saver here has this bond, okay? And the government says, okay. And we are over here, we were at 6%, right? Let's make sure we're trying to stay consistent. We've got 6% interest rates, okay? Let's say that the government wants to make things bigger, okay? So bigger, expansion, right? They're going to buy their bonds back. Okay, so what has to happen when they buy their bonds back? Well, they're going to give the money back to the saver. The bond is going to come back over here to the government. Okay, so this is gone. The money's here. What is this saver going to do with some of that money? They're going to put that money into the bank. Now the bank has more money in it. So what's the bank going to do now that they have more bananas to sell? They're going to lower interest rates back to 5% or 4%, whatever that percentage is. Maybe it's not a full percentage point, but that is how the Federal Reserve affects how much money I have to save or anyone has to save in the bank. A little bit of a difficult process to show without being in person and just drawing it on a graph there. Hopefully things